Hi, I'm Amber Steed, and I'm a fisheries biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks out of Region 1 here in Kalispell. And I'm down here at the Flathead River to tell you a little bit about an angler survey that we'll be delving into in a series of short upcoming videos. So these surveys are really useful to managers and as a way to connect directly with anglers and to use their observations to inform fisheries management. So in these videos, we'll be diving into how we conducted the study, the types of questions that we asked anglers, and of course what we found. Some of the things we learned include how has fishing pressure changed over time, both across the entire river as well as different sections and seasons. What do harvest rates and catch rates look like for different fish species? What are people targeting? And a lot more. And of course, we also learned a little bit about what non-angling use of the river looks like over different seasons. We'll also be connecting the dots for how all of this information actually impacts you through fish management decisions. So whether you fish or not, we think you'll be interested to hear what we learned from our anglers up here in the Flathead.
Hi, I'm Dylan Tabish with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and I'm here with Amber Steed, a fisheries biologist with FWP. And Amber's been working on a really interesting project that involved an angler survey known as a creel survey here in northwest Montana. And she's going to give a presentation explaining that survey and what it involved and why it's important for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in our ongoing research and monitoring and management, but also why it's important for anglers. And it's just some really interesting data in this research that Amber's been collecting with her teams.
Well, thanks, Dylan. So we thought this was a good time to share this study that we did because rivers are kind of peaked. They're going to start to come down pretty soon, become more fishable. And as people are thinking about getting out there, it's kind of good to know what we understand about managing our fisheries and what we've learned from anglers. So I'm just going to share a presentation of some of what we've found in a recent study. So this is an angler survey that was done during 2015 and part of 2016. And we call this an angler survey. Sometimes you'll hear the term creel survey, but either way, I'll explain kind of what that means in a second. But these studies are one of the most direct ways that anglers can influence or have their what they're catching, what they're seeing on the river, their observations directly inform management of that fishery. So it's a great way for us at FWP to connect with anglers, to have that in-person connection and hear what you're seeing. And it really helps us inform management. It's one of the most direct ways that, say, fishing regulations are informed and conservation actions can take place on the river. So it's really useful for us. So just to define the two, creel surveys are pretty directed at anglers with one-on-one interviews talking about what did you catch, what did you harvest, whereas these angler surveys, the way we describe them is broader. It usually does include that creel survey piece, but more information is collected, like where were you fishing and what kind of gear were you using? Where are you from? Did you use a guide? So there's a lot we can say with these angler surveys. Of course, this wasn't the first angler survey to take place. Some of the more recent surveys on the Flathead River were in the early 1990s. And this one included both the main stem, which is just upstream of Flathead Lake, as well as the North and Middle Forks. And then in the early 2000s, there was another one just focused on the main stem Flathead River, which is what we're talking about today too. And so we're able to make a lot of direct comparisons to what happened around, well, now almost 2 decades ago. And the reason these surveys are kind of not done annually and sometimes a long stretch of time goes between them is there's a lot of effort that goes into them. You know, the value of the information is really high, but the time and resources spent collecting this information, it can be intensive. And over the course of a year, that adds up. But it is really informative for managers to have this information. So we felt it was time to do it again. So here's a map of the study area we focused on. So here we are in northwest Montana, and this is the main stem Flathead River. So upstream, you have where my cursor is, where the North and Middle Fork Flathead Rivers join, and it flows down all the way to where it meets Flathead Lake. And you see these red lines and section numbers. So we chose to break the whole river into these sections because we know the fishing experience up here in what we're calling section 4 between Blankenship Bridge and Columbia Falls is going to be different than what we see down. We call this section 5 or the lower river sloughs. So a slough, just in case you don't know, is a portion of the river that used to be connected, but now it's become disconnected to the river flow. It still kind of has some water exchange, but it's more of like a lake-like fishery. So we know that's going to be different than up here. And so this allows us to make comparisons over these different parts of the river over time. So getting a little deeper into the study area here, we have these fishing access sites. So this is where we went to talk to anglers. There's a handful of them along the whole system. It's a pretty big area. So we had to kind of concentrate our efforts in contacting anglers, whether they're shore anglers or people that put in a drift boat or a raft up here and float down to House of Mystery. So we can talk to them about their fishing experiences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did this and then a little bit also about what we found. So we talk a lot in these studies about fishing pressure or angling pressure, and what does that mean? It's essentially a way to gauge how much fishing is going on the river. So we report that as angler hours, just a technical term, but it gives you an idea of how much pressure is occurring on that fishing resource. So we collected this information using both those interviews that I talked about where we went to those fishing access sites and talked to anglers, collected all sorts of information, but also using flights. So with a plane kind of like this Cessna up here, we would have a surveyor go fly over that whole system that we're interested in and count the number of users and describe the kind of users they're seeing. And I'll show you a map of that in just a second. So we combined that information to get an idea of what the pressure on the resource was throughout the course of that year-long study. Some of the questions we asked people included, what are you catching? Of course, what are you harvesting? What are you targeting? What kind of fish are you hoping to catch? Some information about anglers themselves. So are you a Montana resident? Did you use a fishing guide? What kind of gear and lures are you using, if that's applicable? So like a lot of information we can collect just by talking to people. Okay, so here is a map of one of those flight surveys I mentioned. So this is just the upper portion of the river, but this is a busy day in July and it kind of shows you just how much use goes on out there. Obviously, these are a lot of scribbly lines. You can't really read it very well, but the point is there's a lot going on this map, a lot of activity. And so the pilot would assign little codes for every person they saw out there. And it shows us whether all of these people are actually fishing, if some of them are, if they're just floating. So when you look out on the river, you can get a better idea of just what proportion of people are actually fishing and what does that translate to for the amount of pressure on that fishery. So that was really helpful information. All right, so I'm going to share a little bit about results and then we'll dive more into the meat of what we found in some follow-up videos, but I wanted to give you just an idea of some of what we found. So again, we've got the map of the whole river here on your left with the different sections. And one of the big takeaways that we found, again, talking about fishing pressure, how much use is the system seeing? Since the early 2000s, we saw a jump by 80% in the amount of pressure. And that sounds like a lot, and it is significant, but it's not really that different from what we see in similar outdoor recreation in the valley. So Glacier National Park, water-based state parks, all saw a huge increase in use during that time window. So it's not a big surprise that we've seen something similar in the Flathead River. And that kind of varies by these sections, but that's the overall trend we saw. One other takeaway, just looking at this graph, I know there's a lot going on there. There's on the bottom here, we call it the x-axis. You've got the months of the year, so from January through December. And then on the y-axis, this up and down, is where we kind of describe fishing pressure. So we call that angler hours. And so every line in this graph is a different section in the river. So from upstream, section 4, working all the way down, you can see what the type of fishing pressure looked like over the course of a year. And so one of the big obvious, probably anyone could make this observation, is that most of our fishing occurs in summer. So these lines are higher when it's May through September. No big surprise there. We did see kind of a change in use in these sloughs. That was one example of a change. So again, the sloughs are kind of these lake-like old river channels that have a little bit different fisheries than the rest of the river. And especially in the wintertime, where we've got ice fishing opportunities over there. And that's the only place that we have that in the river system. So you see really high values in January, November, December, when you're able to ice fish out there. But the sloughs in general received the most pressure over the course of the year compared to all these other sections, which is a little bit of a surprise for us. So there's a lot more to share, but just wanted to give you a little snippet of some of what we found and what we did. And we'll talk more about that in some future videos.